You are lying on a stone table in the shade of a riverbank workshop. It is 1200 BCE. The air smells of resin, salt, and something sweeter underneath the smell the embalmers call the scent of eternity. Your skin is already cool. Around you, 4 men move with the calm efficiency of people who have done this hundreds of times before. This is not a funeral. This is a 70-day industrial process, and you are the raw material. Here is the disruption. The most important organ in your body, the one modern science says makes you you, is the first thing they throw away. The embalmers do not preserve the brain. They pull it out through your nose, in pieces, with a bronze hook, and discard it as waste. To the ancient Egyptians, the brain was packing material. The heart, not the brain, was where thought and memory lived. And the heart is the one organ they leave inside the body, wrapped and protected, because you would need it to think in the next world. By the end of this video, the way you picture preserving a person is going to fall apart, because what the Egyptians were preserving was never the body you'd recognize. Start with the man who told us most of what we know, Herodotus, a Greek historian who traveled through Egypt around 450 BCE, 5 centuries after the peak of mummification. He interviewed embalmers directly in the city of Sais, in the Nile Delta, and recorded 3 tiers of service, a detail almost nobody expects. The premium package, reserved for the wealthy, took 70 days and used imported cedar oil and myrrh from as far as modern-day Yemen and Somalia. Herodotus estimated its cost at 1 silver talent, the equivalent of a skilled laborer's wages for years. The mid-tier package used cedar oil injected into the body cavity without full organ removal. The budget option, for the poor, was little more than a salt bath, a version of preservation available, Herodotus wrote, to anyone who could afford burial at all. The workshop itself had a name, the Waybit, the pure place, usually built near the edge of the desert at sites like Saqqara and Deir el-Bahari, close enough to the Nile for water, far enough from the village for the smell. Inside, the chief embalmer wore a jackal mask to become Anubis, the god of embalming, for the duration of the ritual. Everyone else worked in silence. There was one man in the workshop nobody envied. Egyptian sources describe a role called the parachistes, the man whose job was to make the first cut into the abdomen with a stone knife. Ancient accounts, including the Greek writer Diodorus Siculus around 60 BCE, describe him being ritually cursed and chased out of the room the moment the incision was made, pelted with stones by the other workers, as if the act of cutting into a body, even a sacred one, carried a stain that had to be driven away. But the nose hook detail is where it gets strange, because removing a brain that way should be nearly impossible. In 2008, a team led by Egyptologist Bob Breyer, a researcher at Long Island University, sometimes called the modern Mr. Mummy, decided to stop theorizing and just try it. Breyer had already spent years studying embalming texts, but no one had ever mummified a human body using only Bronze Age tools and techniques. So he obtained legal donor remains and did exactly that, documenting every step for a National Geographic study. The nasal extraction, it turned out, worked, but not the way most people imagine. The bronze hook was not used to pull the brain out whole. It was whisked inside the skull to liquefy the tissue, which was then drained out through the nostril. Or the body was simply turned face down and gravity did the rest. Breyer's team found that a skilled embalmer could clear a skull in under 2 hours. The nasal bone had to be broken to create the passage, a fact confirmed by CT scans of real mummies in a 1970s radiological survey out of the University of Michigan, which found fracture patterns in the ethmoid bone in nearly every well-preserved specimen examined. Even the eyes were a problem the embalmers had to solve. A sunken eye socket collapses within days of death, and a collapsed face was considered unfit for the Ka to return to. Radiological studies of the mummy of Ramesses IV, who died around 1149 BCE, found small linen pads and in at least one documented case, dried onions packed beneath the eyelids to restore the curve of the eye. Breyer has argued the onions may have been used less for shape and more because their sulfur compounds were believed, wrongly but sincerely, to have preservative properties. That's not the whole story though, because the brain was the easy part. The real work happened lower down, and it involved something the embalmers guarded as trade knowledge, a substance called natron. Natron is a naturally occurring salt compound, a mix of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate that the Egyptians mined from a single major source, the Wadi Natron, a chain of dry lake beds about 60 kilometers northwest of Cairo, where mineral-rich water evaporates and leaves crystalline deposits behind. After the internal organs were removed through a small incision on the left side of the abdomen, all except the heart, the entire body cavity was packed with natron, and the body itself was buried under mounds of it, like a fish in salt. For a period, Herodotus and later chemical analysis both place at around 40 days. Natron pulls water out of tissue through through osmosis, and a human body is roughly 60% water. Remove that, and the bacteria that cause decay have nothing left to work with. In 1994, a chemist named Stephen Buckley, working with the Manchester Mummy Project at the University of Manchester, ran gas chromatography on tissue samples from mummies dated across 4,000 years of Egyptian history and confirmed natron use was remarkably consistent. The same core recipe, refined only slightly, from the Old Kingdom around 2600 BCE, all the way through the Roman period. Buckley's later research, published in 2018 alongside chemist Jana Jones, identified a similar preservative mixture of plant oils, aromatic tree resins, and antibacterial compounds in linen wrappings from Badari. Dating back to roughly 4,300 BCE, nearly 1,500 years before Egypt's first pyramids, suggesting the science of embalming was already being tested long before it became a state ritual. But the organs pulled from the body did not go into a bin. They went somewhere far more specific, and that's where the process stops looking like preservation and starts looking like something closer to reconstruction. The lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines were each dried separately in natron, then wrapped in linen and placed inside 4 containers known as canopic jars. Each jar was carved with the head of one of the 4 sons of Horus Imsidi, Hapi, Duamutef, and Kebe-Senuef, and each son was believed to be protected in turn by a specific goddess. The liver went with the human-headed Imsidi, guarded by Isis. The lungs went with the baboon-headed Hapi, guarded by Nephthys. The stomach went with the jackal-headed Duamutef, guarded by Neith, and the intestines went with the falcon-headed Kebe-Senuef, guarded by Serket. This was not storage. It was a second, parallel burial happening in miniature. 4 gods, standing watch over 4 pieces of a single person, sealed in jars that were often carved from calcite quarried at Hatnub, over 300 kilometers south of Cairo. By the time the body itself was ready for wrapping, roughly 260 hours of linen bandaging lay ahead, a figure calculated by conservators at the British Museum after unwrapping and documenting mummies in their collection during the 20th century. Some mummies used over 300 square meters of linen, layered with resin between wrappings to bond them into something closer to a shell than a shroud. Much of that resin, analysis has shown, was pistacia and pine, traded north from the Levant, while some of the rarer aromatic resins used on royal mummies have chemical signatures matching trees found only around the Horn of Africa cargo from the trading expeditions to the land the Egyptians called Punt, most famously commissioned by Queen Hatshepsut around 1470 BCE. Amulets were tucked between the layers at precise points, a heart scarab over the chest, inscribed with a spell instructing the heart not to testify against its owner when it was weighed against the feather of Ma'at in the afterlife. Except there was a problem, and it is one almost no documentary mentions. The Egyptians were not trying to freeze a body in time the way a modern person might picture cryonics. They were trying to keep a shape, a recognizable form. The soul, or Ka, could return to and recognize as home. When the natural drying process left a body looking sunken or distorted, later embalmers, especially from the 21st dynasty onward around 1000 BCE, began packing the skin from underneath with linen, sawdust, and even mud, pushed in through small incisions to restore lifelike volume to the cheeks and limbs. Radiographic studies from the Cairo Museum in the 1960s found subcutaneous packing material in multiple royal mummies, including techniques used on the body of Ramesses III. In some cases, embalmers went further still, inserting small artificial eyes made of stone or glass into the sockets and using resin-soaked linen to rebuild a nose or fill a cheek that had collapsed during drying, effectively re-sculpting a face that decomposition had already begun to take apart. They were not just preserving a corpse. They were sculpting one, rebuilding a face for a soul that hadn't arrived yet, out of the same salt, sawdust, and linen you'd find in any embalmer's workshop on the edge of the desert. Every time you've assumed the past was cruder than the present, somewhere a Bronze Age craftsman was already solving a problem you'd assume needed a laboratory. The oldest questions about what a body is for didn't start with modern medicine. They started on a stone table by the Nile with a hook, a jar, and 40 days of salt.